What's going on, everyone? It's John with The Catch. Today we're going to talk about tight ends and where you should be drafting them in the 2021 NFL Fantasy Football Draft. So your general consensus this year is obviously Travis Kelce, Darren Waller, and George Kittle being that tier 1 of tight ends to draft. A lot of the mock drafts I've been doing and a lot of the projections that I've been looking at, you are spending a pretty penny on those 3 tight ends. If that's your goal, if you want a tight end that you're going to be able to rely on week after week, no matter what, have no worries about the position, then I'm all for it. Go ahead and draft those tight ends in the first round or early in the second round, because that's where you need to get these guys right now. I've seen Travis Kelce in mock drafts go as early as the 8th overall pick, but anywhere after pick 8, I think he's fair game. In most drafts, personally, I've seen Darren Waller go before George Kittle, but I think either one is interchangeable. Just know that even when you're going into tier 2, Mark Andrews is going very early in drafts too, at least in the 3rd round. And although I personally love Mark Andrews, I've had him on my roster the last 2 years in fantasy football. I personally am not going to be reaching for him this year. Main reason being is that there's so much depth at the tight end position. I am actually really excited when evaluating tight ends this year. Far more excited than I've been in recent years. Upside at the tight end position is huge as well. I think this is a great year to be drafting tight ends. And there are definitely strategies that, promote drafting a tight end early, but I see no reason for it this year, and we'll get into that in this video. If you do enjoy this video, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe for more future content like this. So, without further ado, let's dive right into it. There's probably going to be a run on quarterbacks of some sorts and skill players still going at the running back and wide receiver position as well. And the interesting thing is Mark Andrews, somewhere in that run, is going to be taken off the board. So after that, you had the decision of, do I reach for a guy like TJ Hockenson, or do I see if he's going to kind of float on and be available in the 4th and 5th round as well? Hockenson is currently at an ADP of number 63, as well as a tight end number 5 overall. Hockenson was last year's fantasy football tight end number 4, also had the 5th most receptions out of any tight end, so had 723 receiving yards and scored 6 touchdowns. When we began to kind of evaluate the 2nd tier tight ends and the 3rd and 4th and even 5th tier tight ends, these are very good numbers. These are also very similar to Mark Andrews' numbers from last year. And I personally look at him as just about as good of a draft pick as Mark Andrews. Obviously, the quarterback position between Lamar Jackson and Jared Goff is a little bit different, but I think that Hockenson is going to have a great year. I think he is a great number 1 tight end to have on your fantasy roster. And I think if you're going to load up at running back or receiver, or even draft 2 running backs, 2 receivers, and a quarterback, you might have the chance to still nab Hockenson. And that is a great fantasy value, especially if you're able to load up at those other positions. With Kenny Golladay and Marvin Jones leaving the team, Hockenson will look to be the focal point of this offense. There is nothing but upside for TJ Hockenson. And like I said, I think he is a solid number 1 tight end that you do not have to reach so early for. Let's talk about my guy, Robert Tonyan. Had him on my team last year. He is one of my favorite tight ends going into this season. I know we don't know if Aaron Rodgers is going to be the quarterback or not, but this guy tied Travis Kelce with the most touchdowns by a tight end last year with 11 touchdowns. He also had over 500 receiving yards, and I know we do not know if Aaron Rodgers is going to be in this offense this coming year. We do not know how this offense will look, but you cannot dispute the fact that in standard fantasy football leagues, this is one of the best tight ends to target, and he is so easily attainable. He is at tight end number 9 currently with an average draft projection of 142. This is someone I have been grabbing in almost all of my mock drafts, and I think he is an amazing value. Even if he does not have 10 or more touchdowns this year, I think he's going to be a solid tight end number 1. Now, the important thing to note about these tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 tight ends is that you will probably be able to draft more than one of them. And even if you do reach for a tight end early, these tight ends are still extremely valuable to observe because they are going to make a perfect tight end 2, a perfect backup tight end on your roster as well. Let's go ahead and talk about Logan Thomas, someone who had 670 receiving yards last year and 6 touchdowns, and really wasn't even fantasy relevant until about week 12. If he had played a full season, he could have easily been on pace with guys like Travis Kelce and Darren Waller. With the addition of Ryan Fitzpatrick at the quarterback position, you've got to assume that the Washington football team is going to be throwing the ball a lot more than last year. Outside of Terry McLaurin, as well as Curtis Samuel, this is going to be the next best fantasy target on this team. Once again, when you look at these stats, they are very similar to that of Mark Andrews, who is going much earlier in fantasy drafts. I'm definitely big on Logan Thomas this year, and I think he is someone who, once again, allows you to load up at other positions such as running back, receiver, and quarterback, and then select a tight end a little bit later on and still get an amazing value without having to reach. Okay, next up is Mike Gesicki of the Miami Dolphins, who I think is another amazing fantasy value. Obviously, the additions of Jalen Waddle as well as Will Fuller to this team are scaring a lot of people away from Mike Gesicki and drafting him in fantasy leagues. Someone who had over 700 receiving yards and 6 touchdowns last year. Hate to keep making this comparison, but very comparable to Mark Andrews. Obviously, we don't know exactly what the Dolphins are going to look like after their offseason additions, but I think if anything, it's going to open up the tight end position. There are a lot of people telling you to stay away from Mike Gesicki, but I think if anything, this offense is only going to improve, and I think that he's going to be a focal part of that, especially in the red zone. Going as tight end number 11, I think that this is someone that, once again, you do not need to reach for, that you can fulfill those other positions and still get a great value at tight end. Okay, let's talk about Tyler Higbee of the Los Angeles Rams real quick. Currently tight end number 12 with an average draft projection of number 136. Love the addition of Matt Stafford to this offense, and with the departure of Gerald Everett to the Seattle Seahawks, I think Tyler Higbee has about as much upside as any tight end this year. Last season, over 500 receiving yards and 5 touchdowns, his best season. And now without having to compete with Gerald Everett for targets, he's up against just that wide receiver core, which is obviously a very, very talented wide receiver core. But I think Tyler Higbee is the prime candidate for a breakout year. And like I said, an average draft projection of 136, he will probably be floating around for a little while. In a 12-man league, he is a great number 2 value. If you're in a 10-man league, he is also a great number 2 value. If you're in a 14 or more league, he is still someone that you have got to target. I personally think this Rams offense is going to be quite explosive this year. I'm really looking forward to Tyler Higbee potentially breaking out and only improving upon what he did last year. Jared Cook is currently tight end number 19. He is going to a team in which he knows the offense, and obviously the scare here is his age. At 34 years old, going into his 9th NFL season, I actually am huge on Jared Cook this year. I don't care how old he is. He is a great fantasy tight end. Yes, he has had his best years with Drew Brees under center, but I think he is someone who always gets overlooked in fantasy. He only had 37 receptions last year and still had over 500 yards and 7 touchdowns last year. With a young Justin Herbert, an offense that is looking to absolutely take off this year, I am so stoked about Jared Cook. And I think that he is a great fantasy value, someone that you can take very late, someone who could be a number 2 or even a number 3 tight end if you have that flex spot and you want that many tight ends on your team. I think in these later rounds, he has more value than a lot of the receivers that will be on the board, a lot of the running backs that will be on the board, as well as any quarterbacks or any other position that will be on the board. I think he is someone that you can target in late rounds and get an absolutely incredible value out of. I want to note that Gronk is currently tight end number 14. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers are going to be a very good football team this year, and they are going to be a team that generates a lot of fantasy value. For such a rusty year, Gronk actually turned out to be a pretty valuable fantasy tight end. Had over 600 receiving yards and 7 touchdowns. He might not be someone that you want to start every single week, but there is certainly value there. I've seen a lot of people mock drafts pass on him, and I've seen him kind of floating around in those later rounds. Like Jared Cook, I think that this is a player who, when you're looking at receivers and running backs in later rounds, he might hold a little bit more value than some of the running backs and receivers that you see circulating. And I think he is definitely still worth a late round fantasy draft pick. Let's kind of back gears up, and I want to just take a note and talk about Dallas Goedert. Dallas Goedert is currently tight end number 7. I think with this Philadelphia Eagles offense, there's obviously going to be some risk because we don't know exactly what it's going to look like with Jalen Hurts under center next year. But I think with that being said, Dallas Goedert might have the most upside of any tight end in this year's fantasy draft. 500 receiving yards last year and 3 touchdowns may not be the best stats necessarily, but I think in terms of having an absolute breakout year, he's right up there with Tyler Higbee. In terms that he doesn't really have a whole lot of competition for targets and receptions. He's proven what he can do at the tight end position, and I think that this is someone that you may have to reach for. He is ranked at tight end number 7 in the top 10. I think that he is someone worth taking a chance on. The last dive we're going to really do is Evan Engram. Engram is currently tight end number 16. I think when evaluating Evan Engram, you have to think in terms of at least half PPR, but especially PPR leagues. There have been a lot of pass catchers added to this Giants offense in the offseason, including Kenny Golladay and tight end Kyle Rudolph. But in terms of receptions as well as receiving yards, Evan Engram actually had his best year since his breakout rookie season last year. He had 63 receptions and 654 receiving yards, and unfortunately only 1 touchdown. In PPR, this is someone that you should absolutely target. At tight end number 16, he is going to be floating around in those later rounds, and he is someone who has a ton of value in those late rounds in terms of PPR leagues. So with all that in mind and evaluating the stats of all these tight ends and all the potential upside, I think there's absolutely no reason to reach for a tight end this year. I understand wanting to solidify the position and taking a player early, and there always seems to be a ton of depth at the receiver and running back position, as well as a lot of value in the quarterback position, which might negate the whole point of this video. But I truly believe that for the first time in a long time, we are going to have the ability as fantasy football managers to select a tight end in the late rounds and still have a very good playoff fantasy worthy football team. I think there's no reason to panic. I think we're going to be okay. I think a lot of tight ends are going to make strides this year in new offenses. Let's just put the pause on the panic button. Tight ends in 2021 are going to be huge contributors to fantasy football teams. And thank you so much for watching this video and joining me, John, with The Catch.